let's get started. And since there have been some comments on how we end up following the same order every time because we go down the list from the top, thought we'd start doing something different and start in the middle, but still sort of cycle back around going down. And since Jenna suggested or found this link and also brought up the topic last week of potentially contributing to other DAOs, I thought, Jenna, if you could kick us off, then we'll go down the list from where you are.
Sure. So I noted I don't remember how I came upon Buzzard, but it is the kind of thing that I'd pin. So I'll own that for sure. I do think that my instinct is towards collaborating is fun and important. So yeah, I'm on board with figuring out how it's going to look. I'm reminded that last Monday, a lot of what Rich talked about, what we ended up talking about was the underbelly of the thing. So in one of the posts has this beautiful picture of a tree. Yeah, the second link, the collaboration mechanisms. So trees coordinating amongst each other through mycelial networks is my jam. And that what we didn't get to last week was what then we can call the overstory. So for example, in Cabin's clarity instance, we didn't really talk much about how do they actually use it. But I think that's a useful distinction. So we'll go with understory, overstory, or underground and overstory as our metaphor space. The other thing that occurs to me is, and I'm really interested to hear what everybody talks about here that know more about the underbelly, which is, I think, Commits, it was you that said that you had a sense that Kia had really made effort to understand the technical underpinnings of all this. So I've wanted to go a little bit in that way, but I clearly can really quickly like max out on my ability to follow or my interest in giving it that kind of juice. So I'll be curious to hear what folks say about how this actually would work. The other thing that I really want to have a chance for us to think about at some point relative to all this is something I picked up somewhere that I can't cite right now, was that Kafka wasn't a metaphor. It was real. He was a bureaucrat. He understood what implacable rules did to people. And I don't yet see how we build this rule-based existence that DAOs are kind of moving towards that doesn't turn into a nightmare. So, putting a pin in that for future use. And then this is just a nice fact, I didn't know that. I had read Daniel Suarez's novels, Damon, whenever they popped up a couple of years ago. I didn't know that one of these articles just says that's sort of where this all spun out from. So they were fun and kind of horrific, of course. Venkat, if there's anything else in particular you wanted me to comment on, otherwise, let's see, we're going in order. So I think I pass off to Mayor today. Hey, Mayor.
Hi. Okay, so I was very interesting overview actually of what they think a DAO is and why they think a DAO is. And I completely share Jenna's worries about are we boxing ourselves into a bureaucracy? We can imagine some dystopian science fiction novel where people built the machines and enslaved them. But I would like to look in the other direction, and I put a quote that all an economic agent needs to survive is capital to allow it to create sellable value. And I looked at the spider, which talked about properties of DAOs, and one of the things they don't seem to have is legibility of resources. And I'll explain what I mean. A lot of people, when you talk to them about NFTs, they say, oh, that's nonsense, that's garbage, what are these bored apes doing, and so on. So just for example, the Bored Ape DAO, I forget the actual name, have a resource which is not legible to other actors. And I think this is one of the powers of DAOs, that because they're autonomous, they are not beholden on many of the values and resources that other organizations or institutions need. So one of the important properties of a DAO is how legible or how translatable is a resource that it has to somebody else. Let's say I built a DAO that's about happiness. I mean, how do you talk between that DAO and a DAO that's about Bitcoin, which is an asset of some kind? I don't know the answer, but it seems to me that assuming, as these articles seem to assume, that DAOs are economic actors in the meaning of money, I don't know, limits what you can really do with DAOs. And when I think of the Yak Collective and I ask myself, okay, what is the value that the Yak Collective is creating? Well, at least until today, it wasn't really money. Creating value, and the value could be interpreted as money to many of the members, but it's not creating money, it's creating something else. Now, a little step further in the same direction is the issue of GDP, or some basic metabolic indicator of what the DAO is doing. So how do we know if the DAO is alive or nearly dead? I don't know the answer. And I will pass it on to Murdis because me doesn't want to talk. Meredith, you're up.
Looks like Meredith is still muted. We'll come back around to her. Nathan,
Can
you
you
want
hear
to go
me?
next?
Can you hear
Oh,
me?
she's there.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah, we can hear you. Go
I
ahead,
pressed
Meredith.
the wrong unmute. So I totally share the same a nightmare scenario. I really enjoyed these essays, and I'm really grateful to have them surface in this conversation. I think it's a really fascinating framework to look at international relations as a model for this. Although I don't agree with the analysis completely, and I think that looking for new metaphors or looking for metaphors to describe this is a very useful activity. I am interested in the DAO to DAO and in different ways DAOs can work together. I am like in a bunch of different communities. I'm seeing like DAO bloat, and I feel like that sort of is like the nature of sort of capitalism, right? You want to growth. And I do think a way out of like the nightmare scenario is to keep DAOs like very small and purpose driven, or and how do you do that? But I those are my sort of reflections. I'm complete. Who is next? It is Nathan.
Well, the person who was supposed to go today but did not. Sorry. So just my thoughts with a quick scan. I really like Meredith's idea of that, like, it's important to keep things focused and purpose driven and kind of keep your focus narrow. I think that that's a problem that affects a lot of organizations. There's a sort of like everything becomes about everything, but it's because that can also become very paralyzing. So I want to second Meredith's notion there. I think I'm not sure I entirely agree with some of the analysis here, even just very early on where they're talking about DAOs not being embedded in higher level institutions, because they are embedded. They're very much code-driven things. Whether that code is, the automations that tend to be the hallmark of DAOs, or the use of blockchain. And I kind of think back to Lawrence Lessig's code is law in cyberspace comments. And I wonder if it's almost better to think of DAOs as orthogonal to corporations, in the sense of corporations operate on one substrate, a legal substrate that makes them possible and enables conflict resolution, whereas DAOs are essentially trying to build in organizations on a different substrate, a code substrate. And so there's no, I'm not sure I agree with the idea that there's no backstop there. It's just that the backstop is a different substrate that it's being built on. I don't know, to keep taking this metaphor further, you could think of governments being, being the oldest of these organizations, being built on, monkey grooming instincts, the more of the social relations between people. So I think that was my main thought there. I think in terms of DAO to DAO relations, I think the cross-funding is the one that makes the most sense. More of like a collaborative joint venture model would be very interesting, but it's not really clear where that fits in. Especially when it comes to our context, because we're pretty different and pretty illegible compared to a lot of what else is in this space. So those are my thoughts, and I will pass it along to Sachin.
Hey. I don't have a lot to add, but I think I like the analogy in some parts, but the whole idea of like international relations itself, it feels like I don't know what other word to use, but like elite overproduction. Like it describes. It seems like it's trying to make legible that something that is not legible. Like, I'm not sure if this is how, or I don't believe this is how, like, the 20th century international relations worked. But I think it's useful as an analogy because if, to Mayor's point of like legibility, if DAOs have extremely high legibility, then a lot of these concepts can make sense there. Otherwise, it doesn't. I found the section on, I think it was section 3A about normative perspectives, non-normative perspectives. I found that section interesting, and it'll be interesting to sort of see what kind of DAOs can collaborate with each other. For example, like DAOs with normative perspectives, can they collaborate with non-normative perspective DAOs? So I found that section interesting. I don't have anything else to add. Venkat?
All right. So, I thought of this topic because last week Jenna was suggesting we should make a small donation to another DAO. I forget which one it was, some project of theirs. And the deadline ran out, and we had some discussion about this. Mira kind of had some objections, and some of us thought it would be interesting to use some of our funds to support what other DAOs are doing. So I thought this would be a useful discussion to frame that sort of thing, because I'm sure if we continue experimenting, more and more like actual opportunities will come up to collaborate with different DAOs on different fronts. So it would be good to have at least some sort of framework for thinking about this stuff. The Kafka angle, I think, is a good one. The way I translate that is there is clearly like extraordinarily high downside to this. So it's like extraordinary downside demand, extraordinary upsides to sort of make it worth doing something. So yeah, I mean, if this goes bad, it's kind of obvious that you'll have these sort of Death Star automation or autonomous entities that might go around doing stuff that nobody wants. So what's the upside? And I was trying to think of like good examples, and obviously it's too early for the DAO space itself to have such examples. But if you look at DAO-like things in the past, one that kind of like suddenly leaped out at me, and I'm surprised I hadn't thought of this before, is the International Space Station. And this is kind of interesting because it's already an extremely complex collaboration between multiple countries. But the interesting thing is that one of these sort of crucial pieces of it is Russia, and Russia is kind of now at war with effectively the rest of the world. But still, the space station is highly complex. A lot of it runs autonomously, clearly, because it has to, like, it's got like power systems, electronics, and there's only a few people up there. And they have like some expertise in running the damn thing, but I'm sure, like, in general, the 3 or 4 astronauts who are up there at any given time don't literally know how to like run the thing. So a lot of it must run itself, or with the use of like ground-based support systems. And like you can see the history of the ISS. One of the reasons for like the US really pushing hard to like redevelop its own human launch and resupply capabilities is they were worried about being totally dependent on Russia's Soyuz rockets to resupply the ISS. And now it's kind of clear that that was a sort of warranted concern. And now we have SpaceX, and soon the Antares rocket is going to launch with the Orion human system for the moon. But I'm sure like that's also part of the capability here. So that brings up an example of, all right, if you have multiple parties in a DAO-like collaboration entity, and there's like low trust between them, and they may sometimes go to war and maybe pull their pieces of the infrastructure or infrastructure support, how do you actually ensure continuity through such messiness? And I can think of other examples, like, the Russian airlines have all been cut off. So you've now got Boeings and Airbuses sitting in Russia without maintenance. And some of the operators are taking risks and flying them without like, maintenance and spare parts lined up. So another case of like, the risks that are inherent in like complex international coalitions, basically, because airliners are again super complex and it takes multiple entities to keep them running, right? So the ISS, I think, is a good example to keep in mind of, yes, there are lots of risks to like complex multi-party coordination, but when it does work, you can do things like literally put a thing in space. So that's the prize. So if you can figure out the Kafkaesque bureaucracy, get past that and actually get to the upside, you might be able to do things that look like the ISS or maybe the Yak rover. Like, our rover project, clearly right now we have nowhere near the capacity to actually pull it off. But since we're planting a seed, maybe other DAOs will get interested in different aspects of it and join us in collaboration. Interesting things could happen, right? So that's the thought I had. To Mayor's point of like, all right, when you have these collaborations, and maybe money is not the best way to measure like the sort of output of things, how do you like measure outputs in ways that create like sort of meaningful collaboration? So how does a DAO doing Bitcoin investment collaborate with a DAO doing happiness, right? And I think ISS is again a good sort of precedent to think about, because up there in space, human currencies are kind of meaningless, and Russia provides, I think, the solar panels, and the living module is Japan or something. It's been a while since I looked up the details, but they're providing like functional capabilities, not like things measured in money. Of course, there's funding as well, but the basis of collaboration is material sort of functional capabilities. So maybe there's a way to measure each DAO based on its like unique capabilities. So maybe the Yak Collective becomes known as, a good place to do this kind of study group, and other DAOs that need a study track on some topic, maybe they collaborated with us to run study tracks, and we measure our GDP based on the number of chats we hold or something like that. Um, to the point of what Meredith said and Nathan echoed on trying to keep it small and purpose driven, that comment reminded me of like the microservices trend in cloud computing and with all the pluses and minuses that go with that. So others here are better equipped to speak to that connection. I just thought I'd point it out. Let's see what else. Oh yeah, the collaboration premise assumes like relatively parallel or convergent premises, and it's not clear to me, and this is where the international relations thing is interesting. It's not clear to me that the DAO-verse is necessarily convergent, because geopolitics and international relations happen on the surface of a sphere where we all share resources like petroleum and other things. So we are forced to collaborate. We are forced to like coordinate and have like multi-party relations. Whereas DAOs so far kind of seem to live in some sort of abstract space where they only need to collaborate to the extent they actually want to. Like, of course, there's some things like, we might be computing over GPUs or blockchain transaction volume or something. But those are kind of like at a low enough level that I don't think that's what we're talking about. And they're also not like, physical land or oil or something like that. They're not the kinds of resources wars are fought over. So it's not clear to me that if there's divergent purposes, there's actually much of a case for much collaboration at all. The last thing that struck me is this Nathan's idea of like, are corporations and DAOs fundamentally divergent? I think that's a good question. So I just thought I'd plus one that, and I'm interested to see if that's kind of like a productive line of thought. All right, I think that's it for me, and I think Ben Mahala said that if you have comments you can share, but you posted that you wanted to listen. But yeah, oh yeah, I just see a comment. Yeah, so you can speak for a bit now and then pass it on to comments.
Ben, if you're talking, I don't think we can hear you.
You're not on mute, but we don't hear you.
Oh, okay, there we go. Sorry. So the Kafka bureaucracy thing, I actually think I saw that thread on Twitter. And that actually had me thinking a day or two ago about how that relates to, I'm not sure if you know, Chapman always references, David Chapman always references something like, I think it's Keigen's different levels, where it's like level 3 is emotional, level 4 is systematic, level 5 is meta rational or whatever. But I kept thinking that Kafka bureaucracy is almost like a particular level 4 systematic failure. And I got to thinking how like Trump and Putin and sort of the mafia also sort of thing is a level 3 failure. And how I was actually pondering of whether there's a 2x2 where you could look at sort of how these two different things trade off on each other. And how like failures that happen in the Kafka bureaucracy are the very different failures from the ones that happened if you're in like a drug gang or something and you have to live by honor, and how many people seem to fail when approached by bureaucracies because they think they're actually dealing with the lower level one. And I kept thinking, and Keigen and David Chapman also talk about like this level 5 meta rational, or what highest level liquid mode or whatever. And I'm not always sure that exactly exists, but that is obviously, I think, the thing you should obviously be aiming for. Can DAOs do that? I think they could end up anywhere on the 3 levels. But I think that goes back to what Venkat was saying about how we want to. The risk is high because anytime you have humans coordinating, the risk is very high. But I think the reward might also be very high. And I think whatever other people said about how you have to focus small to sort of get around the failures of both, ending up as sort of a structuralist tyranny, and the failures of in trying to encode everything into a rigid bureaucracy that ends up being ridiculous. Anyway, that just sparked some other thoughts I had previously. So I think I will now pass it on. I think it was Commits.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, I don't know that I have much to add to this necessarily. I think one thing that I've been thinking about a little bit is, so I've been looking at this project called Holly Plus, which has been around for a while, and I think I might have mentioned it in a previous meeting. And there's the way that that project works is there's a machine learning model that is based around the voice of a musician, composer, singer, Holly Herndon, and people are able to submit their tracks to this website that will then convert them into the vocal model of Holly. And then there are these byproducts, these recordings, and these pieces that have the kind of digital likeness of Holly's voice. And so there's a kind of permissionless identity system at play here. And what's sort of interesting about that project is you have Holly has set up a DAO in order to effectively manage the kind of canon of those outputs. So it's permissionless in the extent that anyone could feed anything into that model and produce something that had the likeness of Holly. However, only certain works get proved, I guess you could say, or canonized by this DAO that is sort of like a steward of this permissionless identity or this permissionless intellectual property. And so like that, like, and then of course, like the way that system works is it goes to auction, and the money that's generated through the sales on the primary and secondary market, there's a split between the creator of the track, the creator of the model, the members of the DAO, and the DAO itself. And so that's like a simple kind of model that's based around like a single personal identity. And I was talking to someone else recently, and they were talking, in on the topic of like machine learning. You could imagine a system where instead of it just being a machine model that's based off of one person's voice, like it is in the case of Holly Plus, it could be, a collective contribution to the corpus that makes up that model. And you could set up a contract where every single time that model was used and one of the works was authenticated or canonized by the DAO, everyone who contributed to that model would automatically receive a split of the revenue. And so it's a more evenly distributed sort of distribution of the revenue going to everyone who contributed to that model. And so here you have kind of like two kind of systems that are kind of basically operating under the same premise, but are disconnected. One where you have a single person's model being permissionlessly accessed and used, and then kind of like attestations by a DAO. And then you have like another similar context where many people in a DAO contribute to a model and they're getting some kind of split. But you can imagine another kind of scenario where you have many Holly pluses. You have like a Holly plus, you have like a Jenna plus, you have a Venkat plus plus, et cetera, et cetera. And these different permissionless identities can then aggregate into a kind of superstructure DAO where the kinds of ways in which they're it would sort of resemble this secondary model that I described, where like everyone's contributing to the model, except each entity would be kind of able to canonize their own individual's works within their own model, and then they could also concatenate and then have a similar kind of machine learning model where they're getting equal revenues. And so this is like a very long-winded way to just sort of like illustrate what a kind of priority aligned, mission aligned, almost medium aligned kind of inter-DAO relationship might look like, where individuals are able to kind of maintain a semblance of autonomy, but they could also decide to collectively contribute all of the works that have been authorized by their DAO into this kind of meta model that then people could continue to work with. And so it's just an offering of some kind of idea for what kind of DAO to DAO model might look like. It's a whole different story to think about what that might mean in the context of something like Yak Collective. If it's the case that, like, you know, what Yak Collective offers are these kind of study tracks, then, you know, you'd have to think about what that would look like in a DAO to DAO context. It seems like study tracks are maybe like a little too generalized, but yes, I don't know exactly how that would translate, but yeah. So that's kind of where my headspace was when I was looking at this piece. And then I see Rafa is just listening today, so if you want to jump in, feel free. But otherwise, maybe we'll just open it up for general discussion.
Oh, wait, no, Grigory hasn't gone yet. So Grigory
Oh,
is
I'm so sorry. I think I saw Grigori said that they were in listen mode today.
Oh, okay.
But also, Grigori, if you want to go, please.
Well, I did write that I am in listen mode today. Just a couple short comments. In my view, to define DAO to DAO collaboration, we need to define much more clearly what each of these two DAOs does and what it is. Otherwise, it kind of does not make much sense, given that each member of the DAO has an autonomy. And the best way to see it is to analyze resources, capabilities, and incentives. Basically, each member of the DAO contributes some capability to the collective. And there should be a clear incentive to contribute this particular capability or part of it to this particular DAO and not to the others as an individual. And in my view, it's quite difficult to establish. So, especially if DAO is kind of a purposeless machine, unstoppable purposeless machine. So without that, DAO cannot really reliably tell to other DAO what kind of resources it has, or in other words, what it can do for the other DAO. And without telling it explicitly, the basis for collaboration is kind of unclear, because everybody wants to know what the other party wants to do for them. And not only know, but make sure that this thing is delivered, whether it's a service or whatever. And it is delivered reliably and properly and in a better way than the initial organization can do it for itself. So, in my view, these are the considerations. And I'm ready to pass it on to whatever the next person is. It's not Rafa, and everybody besides Rafa already went. So probably we should open it for a discussion.
Yep, floor is open for additional comments.
Can we take a few moments to talk about a couple of the decisions that didn't happen? So just to remind folks, we had that Colony thing where we didn't know Colony had a built-in, I think it was 72 hours. So a couple of us went to vote after it was over later in the week. And then last week, the Gitcoin thing for the Zodiac Wiki. was a more generous timeline. I made sure I was explicit, but it was pretty much crickets. We had a quick burst of conversation, but then nobody else from the multisig chimed in, let alone other Yak members. And the conversation about it kind of devolved to Mayor, which I respect, saying, we should spend it on our own stuff, though took me a while to formulate this, but it was spending on our own stuff in the sense of it would have been I would have called it a marketing expense. So both the spirit of collaboration with other DAOs doing interesting things that we would support, but also for our own visibility over there. So those are the two most recent ones. And that to the extent that we intend to be a low energy, slow tempo thing, and the fun of starting something up versus the drag of governance is a well-known and great divide. In fact, if you haven't listened to it, PJ Votes new podcast actually interviewed a bunch of the Constitution DAO folks. So it's called Crypto Land. Ha ha ha. If you haven't listened to it, it's just a fun check in on how that, they exploded, and then immediately they were all exhausted after the bidding didn't work. And the governance of Constitution DAO becomes a completely separate thing. So I'll shut up and pass it to whoever wants to chime in on that stuff.
I had a thought in response to what Grigory was saying, like if two DAOs want to collaborate, they have to be very clear and so forth. I think the right mental model to have is not two, but like 2 billion. Like, what if there are 2 billion DAOs and they form this kind of internet of DAOs? What's the protocol for like discovery and like handshaking and like basically building a service-oriented architecture, not within a single organization, but across the entire ecosystem? What would that look like? I think that's the scale at which the problem might get solved. And the other comment I had was, I'm glad Rafa is here, even if only in listening mode. One of the interesting challenges is just discovery of the map of DAOs and the existing interrelationships, so you can navigate and find, the best other DAOs to collaborate with. Like right now, it's like completely ad hoc. And for example, the reason we have like some vague relations with the Mirror and Cabin and Gnosis DAOs is like purely accidental personal relations, which is not ideal. So ideally, there should be sort of a global map of DAOs with like the links pointed out saying, Mirror and Gnosis participate in this collaboration for XYZ, and maybe other people want to join that, something like that. So maybe entities that have a relatively central hub-like location, like Mirror or Gnosis, because they serve a larger purpose, they're in an ideal position to construct maps of the DAO globe, basically. So that would be something I'd like to see happen. Anyway.
Well, I would like to pick up what Jenna said, but instead of arguing my position, I'd like to suggest that we take it as a test case. So if we want to give money to another DAO, there's a marketing side of it and a collaborating side of it. So on the marketing side, we're making the Yak Collective visible to the human agents of that other DAO, and hopefully positioning, and tomorrow they'll give us money and so on. But the collaboration side, and I'm not poo-pooing that at all, I just don't know how to model it. On the other hand, the collaboration side seems to be missing a piece. We're giving them money, but what is the Yak Collective getting in return, and how does the Yak Collective model what it's getting in return? So basically, this is a in miniature example of a DAO-to-DAO collaboration, and I'm definitely for giving them money in order to experiment in DAO-to-DAO collaborations. I'm just missing part of the tooling to understand which part of the DAO is giving and which part, I'm talking about the Yak Collective, is getting, and what's it doing with outcome. So that's how I suggest we move forward on that question. Instead of it being a marketing expense, it should be a DAO collaboration expense. But in that case, we have to somehow define what we're doing and keep track of it.
I think that specific opportunity has passed, by the way. The deadline was Friday or something. So it's kind of like a theoretical hindsight exercise. But yeah, I agree we need mental models for both a marketing relationship and a collaboration relationship. And I think that fits within the general framework of this discussion of like there's many dimensions to a collaborative relationship, and maybe there's like generic pieces and sometimes there'll be completely specific ones. Like, if you're relating with Cabin DAO, chances are you're relating over like physical cabins and stuff like that. So that's worth thinking about. And also, like, what do we offer to others in terms of why would others want to collaborate with us? Right, couple more minutes left. Anybody have stuff to say? Closing thoughts? So looks like we're done for the day, and see you guys next Monday. I believe next Monday is also open on the agenda. So if somebody wants to sign up to lead a discussion, feel free to post on the channel and claim it. If not, we'll pick another reading and do a reading-based discussion again next week. All right. See you guys next Monday.